Welcome everyone to session 2 of this year's class. And I want to start out by saying, for those of you who participated in our wonderful Shabbaton yesterday, on Friday night and yesterday, I want to thank everyone for participating, and to those who helped sponsor the Shabbaton, a special gratitude. And I think it was wonderful. So I'm glad a number of you on the screen were able to participate in what was really, I think, in a great Shabbat experience and an enlightening intellectual encounter with Professor Mark Shapiro. And we're actually, the topic of my class will, to some extent, continue some aspect of his sermons yesterday about trying to arrive at the truth of the Torah and what the latitude of the rabbinic tradition has been in trying to determine God's will as reflected in the Torah. So let me share my screen. Hold on a second. That's not what I wanted. Let me try that again. Hold on. Okay. I hope that succeeded. So we are now in session 2. The session 1 was entitled "The Torah's No Amendment Clause," and I'm going to try to catch everyone up. I'm not sure everyone was either on the first session or has listened to the recording, so I'm going to quickly catch everyone up so we're on the same page about what we're talking about, so that no one feels as if he or she is sort of behind the curve. And then we will move to the new materials. The title of this session 2 is "The Scope of the No Amendment Clause." So let me go back to the fundamentals. And just to remind everyone, the Torah, what we're talking about is a certain clause in the Torah that is called Bal Tosif or Bal Tigra. Those are two actually different aspects, two different commandments, two different sides of the coin that I am calling the No Amendment Clause in the Torah. There are two passages in the Torah that seem to indicate that we, recipients of the Torah, have no capacity or latitude to amend it in any way. We can't add to it, and we can't take anything away from it. And again, a reminder about fundamentals. The Torah in classical Jewish tradition was considered the will and word of God. So every word, every letter counted in terms of potential meaning that we could extract from it. And it embodied God's will. So we had to try as best as we could to try to understand it in all of its detail and in its full breadth of scope that could apply to our lives. So we moderns sometimes have trouble relating to the Torah in that way, but for for centuries and centuries, that's how Jews view the Torah until the modern period. Many Jews still do, but there was sort of a rupture in that way of looking at the Torah. But I want to get us back in time. So I'm trying to inhabit the minds of Jews in the classical Jewish tradition, in which the Torah embodied God's word and will, and everything in it counted, and nothing could be discounted. So just getting back to the basics of this year's course about Bal Tosif, the No Amendment Clause. Deuteronomy 4, chapter 4 says, in the underlined passage, "You shall not add anything to what I command you or take anything away from it. Lo tosifu al hadavar asher anochi metzaveh etchem velo tigreu mimenu." And then, for good measure, there's a second mention of this no amendment clause. Be careful to observe only that which I enjoin upon you, neither add to it nor take away from it. The operative language, lo tosef alav velo tigra mimenu. And again, just a sort of vocabulary reminder, I'm going to refer to this in English as the no amendment clause. In Hebrew, it's two sides of that coin, bal tosif, you shall not add to the Torah, and bal tigra, you shall not take away from. So those are the two basic passages in the Torah that seem very clearly and straightforwardly to say that we have no ability to amend the revelation that God has provided at Mount Sinai. And again, I use Mount Sinai as a proxy for all of the revelation that God conveyed via Moses to the Israelites at Mount Sinai and in the tent of meeting along the way in the wilderness wanderings. So I'm not going to go through all the same passages that we looked at last week, but I did try to trace the intellectual history of what I think is a concern with the continuing viability of prophecy. That is, we got the original Torah in the classical Jewish traditional view from God via Moses, and Moses was unique in his prophetic capacity. And the concern is that if future prophets after the time of Moses arise and try to change the revelation that Moses conveyed in this way or that way, that will be a threat to the continuing stability of the revelation that God provided. So the rabbis, the later rabbis, centuries later, had a concern with this continuing threat of prophecy that might destabilize, that might be debilitating in terms of the continuing viability and validity of the revelation that was given previously by God through Moses. And so they were suspicious or cynical about the role of continuing prophets. And we looked last week, I'm just going to have some highlights from last week. This is a verse from Leviticus chapter 27. These are the commandments that God gave Moses for the Israelites on Mount Sinai. A pretty mundane sort of verse in the Torah. But the rabbis, again, in the early centuries after the Common Era, they read a lot into that verse, and we'll come back to this theme of the rabbis reading into the verses of the Torah. But they read a lot into it. It was of great significance to them. They wrote, based on this passage in Leviticus, these are the commandments that God gave Moses. They wrote in Tractate Shabbat of the Babylonian Talmud, these are the commandments. The word these underscores that a prophet is not permitted to innovate any new element related to the Torah and mitzvot from here on. So essentially, the rabbis are saying prophecy had no continuing role to play with respect to uncovering the meaning of the Torah, really after Moses. That after Moses, the Torah was given to the people. We'll come back to this theme. And it was the sages' right and capacity and mandate to try to uncover the meaning of the Torah. So the rabbis were had their trepidations about prophets who might arise, who might lay claim to altering and amending the Torah. So again, we're going to skip all these passages that we went through last time, and just another highlight before we turn to the new materials. Number 19, Sefer HaChinuch was an important medieval book about the commandments. It literally means the book of education, but it was about all the commandments. And as I mentioned, the no amendment clause and the two sides of it, the two sides of that coin in Baal Tosif and Baal Tigra, are actual commandments. They're not just provisions of the Torah. They're actually counted among, I think by everyone, among the 613 commandments. There are disputes about which portions of the Torah actually comprise those 613 commandments, but I believe it is a consensus that the Baal Tosif and Baal Tigrach clauses of the No Amendment Clause are themselves two separate commandments. And Sefer HaChinuch tries to illuminate the philosophical underpinnings of each commandment. And it says about the commandment of Baal Tosif, you shall not add, the philosophical underpinning is that the master of the world who commanded us about the Torah, that is God, blessed be he, is completely perfect, and all of his acts and commands are perfect and good. And the implication of that is the revelation that he provided via Moses at Mount Sinai and in the wilderness of the Torah is itself perfect. And there is a sense of perfection also meaning all-encompassing, that there's really nothing to be added to the Torah because it itself has everything we need in it. And so he concludes, and so adding to them, to God's commandments in the written Torah, amounts to a detraction. So even if we think we're embellishing, that we're improving it, that really is, you can't improve something that is already perfect. And so if we add to it in any sense, we're actually detracting from it and lessening its value. And of course, all the more so if we actually subtract from it, are we detracting from it? And that is a clear matter. So the underpinning of the classical Jewish view is that the Torah is perfect, all-encompassing. We'll see that it is supplemented by rabbinic traditions, but in at least some sense, it is self-sufficient and should not be added to or subtracted from. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to I inserted a new source here, and then I just want to remind you about a few more of the ones we did last week. So the issue is, if the assumption of the classical Jewish tradition is that the Torah is complete, perfect, all-encompassing, there are undeniably, however, gaps in the details of the Torah. There are several examples of this, but the revelation that God gave was actually not self-sufficient, and that was proven within the Torah itself. There are, again, a few examples. I chose one. This is from the book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Pentateuch, Bamidbar. And it says, once when the Israelites were in the wilderness, they came upon a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. People refer to this as the incident of the wood gatherer on the Sabbath. Those who found him as he was gathering wood brought him before Moses, Aaron, and the community leadership. He was placed in custody, for it had not been specified what should be done to him. They knew that it was wrong. I'm inferring they knew it was wrong to gather wood on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, but they didn't know what the consequences should be for such a violation of the Sabbath rules, because there was a lacuna, a gap that had to be filled in that legal system relating to Shabbat. Then God said to Moses, so one can infer that there was an appeal to God. What should we do with this person that we know violated the Sabbath, but we're not sure what the consequences should be? God said to Moses, the party in question shall be put to death. So it's a very stringent punishment for gathering wood on the Sabbath. The community leadership shall pelt him with stones outside the camp. So the community leadership took him outside the camp and stoned him to death as God had commanded Moses. So in one sense, this can be considered just a continuation of the revelation at Mount Sinai. An incident arose and God supplemented God's own revelation to Moses by disclosing a detail about the punishment that should be applied to the wood gatherer. But the incident, I think, displays the fact that in many respects, the Torah is not self-fulfilling. It's actually not self-sufficient. It doesn't provide details about every occasion or incident or eventuality that might arise in the future. And so, therefore, somehow we have to supplement the Torah to fill in the gaps, to fill in those details. But we have to do so in light of the No Amendment Clause. And so that's the challenge. How do we flesh out the details of the Torah in light of these explicit verses that say you can't add to the Torah, you can't amend it? in the Torah itself, this incident of the wood gatherer indicates that when Moses was around, there was already there was a viable vehicle to receive God's word and to convey it to the people. Even here it says, then God said to Moses. Moses was the intermediary. God revealed to Moses what God's intent was about the consequences with respect to the wood gathering on Shabbat. And the people implemented God's will via Moses. But we don't have Moses anymore, and Moses hasn't been around in a long time. So this gives rise to the issue of, if the Torah is not self-sufficient, is not self-fulfilling, because there are prescriptions in it, but they are not all-encompassing with respect to every imaginable circumstance, and we no longer have access to Moses as the unique prophet in the Jewish tradition, and we're mindful of the fact that the rabbis are fairly suspicious of new prophets, post-Mosaic prophets, who might want to tell us how to tinker with the Torah in this way or that, or who tell us that the Torah has been superseded, for example, that has given rise to competing religions. We no longer have this ready access to God. So there have to be other ways to fill in the gaps. And that gets us to the challenge. How do we do that without running afoul, without violating the commandment, the dual commandment of not adding to or not taking away from the Torah, the no amendment clause? So getting back to that, the Bal Tosif, the commandment, you shall not add, this is the classical view embodied in Rashi's commentary on that passage from Deuteronomy. What do we mean? Rashi is telling us, what does the Torah mean as viewed through the prism of the rabbinic tradition in telling us you shall not add? And I noted that Rashi's explanation seems to be interesting in at least two respects. One is that it seems to apply the prohibition of not adding, of not amending, seems to apply perhaps only to existing commandments, and it applies in sort of a quantitative fashion, that there are 4 passages in the Tefillin that have been mandated, and if someone or some sage or some group says put in 5, that's prohibited. We take up 4 species of plants in fulfilling the commandment of the lulav on Sukkot. And so if someone says take 5, that's a violation. We have 4 fringes. And if someone says put a 5th on tzitzit to comprise the tzitzit, that would also run afoul of the no amendment clause. So Rashi may not be giving a fully comprehensive view, but perhaps this is a fairly narrow view of the Jewish tradition, of the Jewish traditional interpretation of Baal Tosif, that it only applies to existing commandments, and it only applies to sort of the quantitative fulfillment of those existing commandments, which sort of begs the question, does it apply at all to brand new commandments? Could you just make up a new commandment? Would that run afoul of the no amendment clause? And we'll come back to that. But in light of Rashi's, he was the authoritative medieval commentator on the Torah, and he generally conveys to us the classical rabbinic view of various passages and commandments. Despite Rashi's view, there are problems associated with that narrow sense of Baal Tosif. And we see even in Tanakh that there were seeming violations of it. And the Tanakh doesn't criticize people in those circumstances. So King Solomon, in 1 Kings, essentially the Tanakh we saw said, the Torah says celebrate Sukkot for 7 days, but Solomon convened a celebration of Sukkot for 14. So he doubled it. That's certainly in violation of Rashi's prescription about the scope of the no amendment clause. And here are others that are problematic, at least on their face, problematic with respect to the no amendment clause in a simple quantitative sense. We saw that the book of Numbers prescribes that the first day, for example, of Passover shall be a sacred occasion. Well, we Jews outside the state of Israel, as we just did recently, celebrated 2 days of Yom Tov, 2 days of sacred occasion to inaugurate the holiday. And again, that doubling of the Torah's prescribed time seems to run afoul of Rashi's prescription. Obviously, the rabbis didn't think it did. So we're going to come back to how did the rabbis navigate and negotiate the work that they were doing in trying to extract the meaning of the Torah without running afoul of the No Amendment Clause. We saw another one. The book of Deuteronomy prescribes a maximum of 40 lashes as punishment for certain violations. And then when the rabbis were sort of fleshing out the system, the halachic, the Jewish legal system, they arrived at a maximum of 39. So this, again, on its face, would seem to be a violation of Bal Tigra, that you should not detract from the Torah. If the Torah said 40, why are the rabbis saying the maximum is only 39? They arrive at it through their own interpretation. Question is, does that interpretation run up against the No Amendment Clause in a way that they cannot justify? Now, they thought they could justify it, but that's the sort of problematic issue that they had to contend with. So here are some, getting to the news sources. Let me start with number 27. I'll just note Michael Berger was a colleague of mine. He started with me in the PhD program in the religion department at Columbia. He's a great scholar. He's he happens to have also Orthodox rabbinic ordination, but he is a professor at Emory University. And this is a really wonderful book that he wrote now many years ago now that arose out of his dissertation called Rabbinic Authority. He's a very sophisticated and knowledgeable scholar, sort of like Professor Mark Shapiro, who was with us at the Shabbaton. And I think Professor Berger really crystallizes what the problem is that I'm trying to convey to you. He wrote in Rabbinic Authority, it is important to realize the inverse relationship existing between these two domains. And in context, he means the written Torah and the whole oral law Torah of the rabbinic interpretation and fleshing out of the written Torah. If one's view of the original revelation is maximalist, meaning if one takes the view that God revealed to Moses and then to the people, not just the written Torah, but a huge body of oral law that accompanied the written Torah, that fleshed out those details that seem to be missing from the written Torah. So if that's your view, that it's a maximalist view in terms of the scope of revelation, such that most, if not all, rabbinic utterances are only the final stage in a long line of transmission back to Sinai, meaning that the rabbis were just faithful transmitters of a tradition of oral interpretation. It was eventually written down, but it was transmitted orally for a long time. So they were faithful transmitters of all sorts of things that don't seem to be present in the written Torah, but actually go back in time, are traceable to the same time period, are traceable to the same period of the Sinai revelation in the wilderness. And if you take that view, then the domain of rabbinic activity that needs to be justified independently is quite small. So if your view of the revelation from Sinai is that almost everything we Jews do these days can be traced back to the Sinai revelation, then anything that seems sort of new or innovative is going to be quite small in scope. And so there's much less to justify. Conversely, Michael wrote, the more one sees the sages as playing an active, even innovative role in the transcription and unfolding of the oral law, then the greater must be the efforts to justify their considerable authority. Meaning, if you take a more minimalistic view that, yes, there was stuff revealed at Mount Sinai to Moses and then to the people, but much of the rest of our tradition is not directly traceable to or attributable to that Sinaitic revelation, then we have to be able to justify how did the rabbis, who gave them the authority to unpack the Torah in the way that they did, such that they seem, in that more minimalistic conception of the original revelation, they seem to have added a lot. There are all sorts of things we Jews do or should do according to the halakha, the Jewish legal system, that are not present, at least in the plain sense of the written Torah. And Michael's whole book about rabbinic authority is justifying, how did the rabbis justify their own authority? And why were they held to be authoritative in the eyes of fellow Jews in terms of their explication of the written Torah? So the more that the sages give the appearance of being innovative and assertive in terms of fleshing out the details of the Torah, for various reasons, but those reasons include, how do they justify what they're doing in light of the no amendment clause, or clauses, the two clauses of the written Torah? So I'm now going to turn to, in these new sources, the various ways that the rabbinic sages, so again, these are the rabbis of, let's say, that the first 5 or 6 centuries of the Common Era, in the Mishnah and in the 2 Talmuds, the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmuds, or the Jerusalem Talmud. How did they go about engaging in their enterprise, their project of trying to understand the word and will of the Torah, of God as embodied in the written Torah? How did they go about that project? And how did they engage in that work in light of the no amendment clauses of the Torah itself? So the first method of their asserting their control over the meaning of the Torah and explicating the meaning of the Torah was through their vast powers of creative interpretation. And I'm gonna just, these are, there could be dozens and dozens of examples of this. I try to pick a few that are very fundamental to Jewish life. So the first one here is from the 5th verse of the entire Torah. God called the light day and called the darkness night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. So you can see the Hebrew, Vayikra Elohim la'or yom v'lachosha kara layla vayi'erev vayivoker yom echad. So we take that for granted as just part of the creation story. But the rabbis, we may also take for granted that, as modern Jews, that the rabbis read an incredible degree of significance into these words. Essentially, much of the Jewish calendar derives from these few words, and it's something that we perhaps take for granted, but we should not. What we take for granted sometimes is that Jewish days start in the evening. They don't start, after midnight or in the morning. Shabbat, for example, and all of the holidays run from the evening before the sort of the first day. That's not self-evident. The Torah doesn't tell us to do that. The rabbis, a fundamental building block of the rabbinic tradition and of the entire Jewish calendar that we live by, is that Jewish days essentially start the evening before. And much of that is derived from these few words that I'll call them a sort of nonpartisan reader may say that's reading too much in here. That's not necessarily what the Torah means, but the rabbis, through their interpretation of these words, extracted an entire Jewish calendar out of it, in terms of when we should be celebrating the Sabbath and our holidays. Second is, again, these are things that are very familiar to all of us. I just want to make sure that we're sort of focused on the power of rabbinic interpretation of the written Torah. And again, I want to be, what my theme is, we should recognize the power of rabbinic interpretation here, but keep in mind, all of this is done in the face of, or in light of, clauses in the Torah that say, don't add to my Torah and don't change it. So this, of course, is one of, I think, 3 occasions in the Torah It says, Lo tefashel gedi b'chale bimo. But I include the whole verse here because kashrut is not the topic. Keeping kosher is not the topic of the paragraph context in which that clause appears 3 times in the Torah. It says, the choice first fruits of your soil you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. And then there's sort of it's a seemingly non sequitur. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. I recall we had a really interesting lecture at Or Zarua a number of years ago by Professor Morty Schwartz from JTS, who I thought gave a very compelling explanation of what that clause means. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, in the context of these the passages in which they appear in the Torah. He connected them to sacrifices, but they're not kashrut. They're not keeping kosher context. But the rabbis extracted from these 5 Hebrew words, much, not all, but because the Torah also has lists of animals that are not kosher, but extracted essentially all of the rules about not eating meat and milk together from those 5 words in the Hebrew. And I'll make a point now that we'll come back to. Those 5 words say, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. One could think and argue that the Torah intends the prohibition of not eating meat and milk to be in very, very narrowly confined. Don't eat a baby goat, I think a kid is, in its own mother's milk. That's what it says. That's what the pshat, the plain sense of the verse says. So one could argue that it's a very narrow prohibition, but the rabbis interpreted in a way that broadened its scope dramatically. You can't eat meat and milk together. That's several leaps and bounds from the simple sense of this. It includes, first of all meat, not just baby goats. It includes all sorts of meat, milk, dairy products, not just milk. And this is confined to a mother's milk. So there are, and by the way, it says nothing about poultry. There's a dispute in the Talmud about whether poultry and milk, whether it's prohibited to eat those together, and there's actually a dispute about that. So I'm trying to make the point that about another basic building block of Judaism about kashrut is really attributable to the derivation of the rabbis through their immense powers of interpretation of very spare words in the Torah. They extract a lot of meaning out of very few words. Another example, this is Exodus chapter 23. It says, you shall serve the Lord your God, who will bless your bread and your water, and I will remove sickness from your midst. Pretty straightforward, pretty mundane. The Hebrew is va'avadatem et Hashem Elohechem, etc. And the Torah has all sorts of passages about us, the need for us to serve God, who took us out of Egypt, who will give us blessings if we serve him. So this is one of sort of a common theme. But the rabbis read a lot into the first 4 words in Hebrew, va'avadatem et Hashem Elohechem. And I'm just an example. This is from Maimonides, from his Mishnah Torah, his great code of Jewish law. Right at the beginning of this, essentially begins his discussion of the laws of prayer in Judaism. And he writes, it is a positive Torah commandment to pray every day. As Exodus states, what we just read, you shall serve the Lord your God. Now, look back at this, Exodus 23. Do you see any commandment to pray every day here? No, there's no, I don't think anyone will argue that the simple sense of this is that you should pray every day, but the rabbis extracted the positive Torah commandment. They say it is a Torah commandment. It's not, they're not saying, oh, we're making up an obligation to pray every day. We're saying, they were saying, and Maimonides is simply conveying what the rabbis of the Talmud already concluded, that our obligation to pray every day is attributable and derived from this Torah verse, and so therefore it is embedded in the revelation of God in the written Torah. So they're not adding anything at all. They're just extracting meaning as we Jews should do. So I wanted to make sure you saw the plain sense and what the rabbis extracted from it. So how do they know? How did the rabbis know that you shall serve the Lord your God? Refers to prayer. Maimonides, again, building on the Talmud, says tradition teaches us that this service. So what it says, you shall serve the Lord. That refers to a service of God. That service is prayer. And there's another proof text. Deuteronomy 11:13 states, "And serve God with all your heart." Well, I just read those English words, and the Hebrew is similar. Those words don't include the word prayer. It just says serve God with all your heart. But there's a further sort of a further link in the interpretive process. Our sages says, what is the service of the heart? So again, they're referring now to Deuteronomy, which is itself sort of building on Exodus. And this service, this service of the heart, I called it heart service, is prayer. So it's a multi-pronged interpretive sequence that derives from that Exodus passage about serving God, that what that means is we should pray every day. Now, Maimonides notes, the number of prayers is not prescribed in the Torah. I mean, no one can point to how many times you should pray. The rabbis did say that, Abraham may have come up with the Shacharit service and etc. The forefathers sort of came up with general times to pray, but the rabbinic tradition encompasses all sorts of additional detail about when we should start our prayers, when we should conclude our prayers. And Maimonides says, nor does it prescribe a specific formula for prayer. The Torah has nowhere says, pray every day, and by the way, say this stuff when you pray every day. That's not what the written Torah says. We only have arrived at that fixed liturgical prayer through the rabbinic tradition. And also, the Rambam notes, according to Torah law, there are no fixed times for prayers. But I added this here. The point of this, though, is that the general commandment to pray every day, the rabbis concluded, and Maimonides endorses and accepts, not surprisingly, that prayer is based on that biblical verse from the book of Exodus and is thus a commandment of the Torah, of God, essentially from Sinai. That the rabbis instituting the entire obligation to pray at certain times and saying certain words, etc., that's just fleshing out, that's standardizing our prayer obligation, but all of it is an elaboration of the divine command. So this interpretation project that fleshes out the details of the Torah, if it's based on a verse of the Torah, or at least arguably rooted in a verse of the Torah, even though we saw that you have to take a few leaps of interpretation to get to where they ended up, which is that there's an obligation to pray every day, to extract all of that meaning from those few words in Exodus. All of that is simply an elaboration of what is there in the Torah. The rabbis didn't think that in interpreting the Torah to conclude that we have to pray every day, that they were adding to the Torah at all. It wasn't a violation of the No Amendment Clause. It wasn't a violation of Baal Tosif. They were simply drawing out of the Torah its proper meaning, and they believe that's what God wanted them to do. Okay, so that gets to, I just touched on the Jewish calendar, kashrut, prayer. These are, of course, building blocks of our Jewish lives. Here's another one, and I'll get back to it as a slight caveat, but here's another one in which no sort of rational person would argue that the mitzvah of lighting candles for Hanukkah is in the Torah. So doesn't our whole obligation, the entire practice of lighting the Chanukiah on Hanukkah, doesn't that represent adding to the Torah? Hanukkah, of course, is a post biblical holiday. and we actually say a blessing. It says that this is from the Talmud. The rabbis are conscious of this problem because they ask in the Talmud, what blessing do we say over the lighting of the Hanukkah candles? One recites, who has made us holy through his commandments and has commanded us to light the Hanukkah light. So they're just referring to the prosaic formula that we say in blessings, Asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. So we say, blessed are you, God. Who commanded? God, you commanded us in your commandments to light the light of Hanukkah, to light the Chanukiah. Does that even make sense? How can we bless God for commanding us to light the Chanukiah if Hanukkah, the events of Hanukkah postdate the Tanakh completely, or certainly the Torah completely? So how could that possibly be the case? How are we justified in saying that God commanded us to light the candles of Hanukkah? And the Gemara, in fact, I'm not making up their sort of self-consciousness about this problem. The Gemara asks, and where did God command us to light the Hanukkah lights? Because it's not mentioned in the Torah. And they have to come up with an answer. And the answer they come up with is hugely significant. And I'm going to try to explain why. The Gemara answers that Rav Avia said the obligation to, this is filled in, to recite this blessing is derived from the verse, you must not deviate from the verdict that they announced to you, either to the right or to the left. So in shorthand fashion, Rav Avia was referring to this phrase, in referring to the phrase lo tasur, you should not deviate. He's referring to this passage in Deuteronomy chapter 17. I'm going to get to it. We'll see it in its biblical context. But this whole category of lo tasur, I could have sort of named my class, you shall not deviate, you must not deviate, because this became essentially a competing biblical allowance for the rabbis in competition with the No Amendment Clause. So we have the No Amendment Clause, Bal Tosif, you shall not add, you shall not detract. Again, I'm calling that in totality the No Amendment Clause. The rabbis said, oh, by the way, there's another verse in Deuteronomy that says, but don't deviate from essentially what we rabbinic sages tell you in every generation to do. Arguably, and there is an argument about this, arguably, those two commandments of you shall not add and you must not deviate. So you must not add to the written Torah, but you must also not deviate from the verdicts and conclusions of rabbinic sages through time. Arguably, those are in competition with each other, that they are somehow difficult to reconcile. And we'll get back to this, but one way of viewing this, if you view it in sort of a maximalist way of what Rav Avi is saying, lo tasur, is that lo tasur, don't deviate, amounts to effectively an amendment clause, that the rabbis are giving themselves the right to actually at least supplement the Torah as they deem fit. And we'll come back to it. But this is a very important passage. They had to justify the formula, and I think they're focused on the formula of the bracha, of the blessing. How can we say the normal blessing of, oh, blessed be God who commanded us, about doing something that is clearly post-biblical, that God could not possibly have revealed the commandment to light the Chanukiah at Mount Sinai, because the events happened so much later. So first I want to get back to Deuteronomy. So the Rav Avia, to rationalize this whole project, and this became the accepted sort of rabbinic view of how to rationalize new sort of obligations that they were coming up with in light of the No Amendment Clause. This lo tasur, you shall not deviate, became a very important sort of slogan of the rabbis, and something that they relied on to an extensive degree in their enterprise, in their project of interpreting the Torah. But I want to look at these verses in the original biblical context, because I will argue that they were reading a lot into it. So they derived their authority that they had great latitude to interpret the Torah. It was all based on their interpretation of these verses. Deuteronomy chapter 17 says in its original context, if a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, so it seems to be criminal law and torts, matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly repair to the place that the Lord your God will have chosen, and appear before the Levitical priests or the magistrate or judge in charge at the time. And I'll just note here, the rabbis sort of put themselves in as the judges in charge at the time of each generation, and present your problem. When the disputants, when they have announced to you, when the judge has announced to you the verdict in the case, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from that place the Lord chose, observing scrupulously all their instructions to you. And here's the operative verse. You shall act in accordance with the instructions given you by the judge, and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announced to you, either to the right or to the left. So here's the Hebrew, lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin usmol. So in its original context, it refers to, it's a judicial context. It refers to a very important, that's an important context. Moses created a judicial system with the help of, and based on the advice of his father-in-law Yitro. And the Torah is saying that when those judges who have authority in their respective times to announce verdicts, you have to implement those verdicts precisely. Now, the rabbis, as we saw, took these few Hebrew words, and particularly this phrase, lo tasur, to mean that they, as interpreters of the Torah, were granted great latitude in interpreting the Torah, and that the Jews who were their sort of essentially their students could not deviate from the words of the sages in interpreting the Torah. I will note, so that the contrast is the biblical context is a judicial one. It's talking about judges. The rabbis, in interpreting the Torah, sometimes functioned as judges, but more often they did not. The Mishnah and the Talmud, it's not a sort of case book of the kind that we American lawyers are used to, in which we read cases that are actual disputes between litigants, and we have the rulings of judges. That's not what the Mishnah and Talmud are. In general, the rabbis were interpreting the Torah in non-judicial settings. Sometimes much of what they were interpreting no longer even had any possible practical implementation after the destruction of the temple. So much of the interpretation of the rabbis was occurring in non-judicial settings, which is different from the original biblical context. And it highlights the fact that the rabbis were assigning to themselves a very important interpretive role with respect to the Torah that was at least one level removed from the plain sense of the Torah. Now, I mentioned before that no sort of rational person, going back to the Hanukkah issue, about how we could say that God commanded us to light the Hanukkah candles, that no rational person would say, oh, the commandment to light the Hanukkah candles, that was revealed at Mount Sinai. Well, apparently, I think there are probably some Jews still today who believe that Hanukkah was revealed by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, the obligation to light the Chanukiah, even though Hanukkah wouldn't happen until 1,000 years later. But Maimonides, in his time, I think felt a need to address that sort of fundamentalist view. He wrote in the Book of Commandments, Sefer HaMitzvot, which is a wonderful book, I'm going to come back to it, that Moses was told at the revelation at Mount Sinai the commandment that in the future, after the period of our sovereignty, there will occur such and such events with the Greeks, and we will then be required to light Hanukkah candles. I don't think that anybody would imagine this or consider it a possibility. So I'm inferring that if there weren't some Jews around who were saying something like this, that Maimonides thought was just silly, that no, Maimonides is saying, of course, Hanukkah wasn't part of the original Mount Sinai revelation. We have to justify, we have to rationalize our lighting of the candles and saying that God commanded us to do so another way. We can't just make up some historical, some irrational historical pretense for it. And the way that Maimonides and the rabbis accepted it was by reference to the Lo Tasur, you shall not deviate passage, which again arose to be sort of a competitor principle to the Baal Tosif, to the No Amendment Clause. And Maimonides further, I'm sorry, not Maimonides, Nachmanides, this is Ramban on that biblical passage on chapter 17. He explicates what lo tasur, you shall not deviate, means in practical terms. He quotes it and then he writes, this is actually Rashi wrote, even if the judge of the great Sanhedrin tells you of the right that it is the left, or about the left that it is right, because remember it said don't deviate to the right or to the left, you must obey him. So even if the rabbinic or judicial sage says, I'm telling you something that you think is completely wrong, you have to obey their conclusion, their interpretation. The essence thereof is that even if you think in your heart that the judge interpreter is mistaken, and the matter is simple in your eyes, just as you know the difference between your right hand and your left hand, you must still do as they command you. And you can't deviate from it. And he gives this is a reference here where it says such was the case. The Talmud has a good example of this, where two great rabbis, Rabbi Joshua and Rabban Gamliel, disputed a very important matter. When did Yom Kippur fall out on the Jewish calendar? And so he recites this story from the Talmud. Such was the case of Rabbi Joshua and Rabban Gamliel. When Rabban Gamliel was the authoritative figure, and Rabbi Joshua thought, he had a minority opinion that Yom Kippur started on a different day. And Rabban Gamliel said, Joshua, you have to follow what we, the majority, is telling you to do. And so he instructed Rabbi Joshua to come to him in a different city with a walking stick and money on the day that Rabbi Joshua thought was Yom Kippur. And so it was a test of Rabbi Joshua's submission to the will of the majority view. So the Ramban is saying even Rabbi Joshua in that circumstance had to violate what he thought was the day of Yom Kippur, because he had to submit to the will of the majority rabbis, the majority of the sages, who said, no, Yom Kippur fell on a different day. And Nachmanides is saying that's important, this idea of not deviating from what the consensus is. Now, the need for this commandment is very great, for the Torah was given to us in written form, and it is known that not all opinions concur on newly arising matters. So again, he's acknowledging that there are new matters reflecting the fact that we don't have, the Torah is not all encompassing with respect to details. And the lo tasur, you shall not deviate, is a preventive principle, because if we didn't follow it, Nachmanides writes, disagreements would thus increase and the one Torah would become many Torahs. And so scripture, the Torah, therefore defined the law that we are to obey the great court that stands before God in the place that he shows, with respect to the interpretation of the Torah, whether they received its interpretation by means of witness from witness going back to Moses. So if it was an ancient tradition of interpreting the Torah, or whether they said so based on the meaning of the words, or its implied meaning. So it doesn't have to be an ancient tradition going back to Moses' time. If the sages of the generation say, this is what the Torah means, that we have to follow their view. And by following their view in conformity with the principle of lo tasur, you shall not deviate, we're not supplementing the Torah. They are simply interpreting the Torah and extracting the meaning from it that God had in mind. The rabbis were not particularly self-conscious about the vast interpretive latitude that they had granted to themselves with respect to the written Torah. They believed they were entitled to interpret the Torah and derive all sorts of new meanings and new laws, new commandments from it, without violating the No Amendment Clause. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, citing this verse from Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, both freshly picked, so that's the proxy for new, and long stored, proxy for old, have I kept, my beloved, for you. Putting aside what that might mean in the context of the Song of Songs, the Talmud says, the congregation of Israel said before the Holy One, I have decreed many decrees upon myself through all the laws that the rabbinic sages have come up with, more than the number that you, God, decreed upon me in the written Torah. And I have fulfilled them, meaning they interpret that verse from Song of Songs to be referring to all the new rabbinic laws that were added to the old laws that God had revealed in the Torah. It was related that Rav Chisda said to one of the sages, did you hear what the meaning of this verse from Song of Songs is? He said to them, these, meaning the new ones, are the more lenient commandments, and the old ones are the more stringent. But Rav Chisda said to him, no, that's not the case. The Torah wasn't given on two separate occasions. Rather, this verse from Song of Songs, the old are the commandments from the Torah, and the new ones are the commandments from the sages. So just an example, the rabbis really didn't seem to be overly self-conscious or worried in most contexts about the fact that they were creating all sorts of new laws to supplement the Torah, to flesh out the details of the Torah. And they didn't believe they were violating the No Amendment Clause. And we'll come back to that. But in some places, they seem conscious or self-conscious about the tension in the fact that they were deriving all sorts of new laws, and they realized that they had to be mindful of the No Amendment Clause. And in others, they didn't seem to be particularly bothered. Here's another passage from the Babylonian Talmud. And again, they're sort of giving this could be the sense of an asmachta, a biblical sort of support. They are another verse from Song of Songs. They interpret, it says, there's two Hebrew words they're deriving a lot of meaning from. Kvutzotav tal talim. Rav Chisda said that, Mar Ukva said, this teaches that it is possible to expound from each and every stroke. So the kots, they're taking from kvutzotav, a variant of, or shorish in that word. So you can expound from each and every stroke of the letters of the Torah, mounds and mounds of laws. Tal talim, they say tile tilim. So again, this is not a formal interpretation, but it suggests that they were deriving from this passage in the Song of Songs, or at least justifying their ability to extract mounds and mounds of laws from the Torah, laws that were clearly not written in any plain sense way in the written Torah itself. But as we know, there are all sorts of laws in the rabbinic tradition that don't appear to be within the scope of the simple, straightforward meaning of the Torah. But the rabbis believed, and largely based on this principle, this competing principle of lo tasur, that we should not deviate from the words of the sages of each generation, that they had the ability, the vast ability, and the far-reaching ability to interpret the Torah. They believed they were extracting meaning that was there. I am going to come back to, in the third session, a very important debate between Maimonides and Nachmanides about the status that should be attributed to rabbinic interpretations of the written Torah. We'll get back to that. It's a really interesting, important debate. But just as a general matter, I'm just trying to establish that the rabbis, and I don't think anyone would argue this, the rabbis believed they had great ability to interpret and great latitude, great discretion to interpret the words of the Torah without violating the No Amendment Clause. I'm not going to read it all, but we referred in the Shabbaton to the story of the Tanur of Achnai. For those who weren't there yesterday, we discussed it with Professor Shapiro, but it's a story of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua arguing, and essentially a divine voice comes down and says, Rabbi Eliezer is right. He's always right. Listen to him. And Rabbi Joshua scolded the miracles that were occurring and said, stop intervening here. So after the bat kol, the divine voice emerged in favor of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Joshua stood on his feet and said, he quoted a verse from Deuteronomy, "It is not in the heavens, lo bashamayim he." It's actually in the Torah, lo vashamayim he, but we refer to it as lo bashamayim he. And the Talmud says, what's the relevance of that phrase in this context? And Rav Yirmiyah says, once the Torah was given at Mount Sinai to the people, to us sages to interpret, we have a new principle that we can invoke, that the majority view is the consensus will carry the day. And here, because the majority of the rabbis were in favor of Rabbi Joshua's view, even though the divine voice had said, by the way, majority, you're wrong. Rabbi Eliezer is correct. Because the Torah itself had already established, according to the rabbis, and we'll get back to this in a moment, according to the rabbis, that majority view carried the day, the rabbis felt entitled to ignore the divine voice. And the Talmud finishes its story by saying, God said at that time of when that happened, my children have triumphed over me, my children have triumphed over me. So God seems to be okay with that outcome of his divine voice being ignored. But the important thing I want for this, for the context of this class, is that the rabbis are relying on this principle of majority rule. So it's in combination with the do not deviate. So we have lo tasur, don't deviate from the rabbinic sages. And with respect to which rabbinic sages we should not deviate from, it's the majority. The majority, the consensus will carry the day. That sort of begs the question, why are there any minority opinions in the Talmud at all? If the majority opinion is the one that we should follow, why does the Talmud also record minority opinions? It's a very interesting point. My teacher, David Weiss-Halivni, wrote about that, about why the Talmud includes minority opinions, even though they were the losers in the Jewish legal debate, and there's a principle of disregarding the minority opinion in favor of the majority. But so the rabbis place a lot of stock in addition to do not deviate, in this phrase from Exodus, incline toward the majority. So again, what I like to do is I like to look back at the original biblical context, to try to appreciate the sort of leap that the rabbis took in reaching that conclusion in reliance on this majority rule principle. In its original biblical context, Exodus says, you must not carry false rumors, you shall not join hands with the guilty to act as a malicious witness. So again, this is a judicial context about litigants and witnesses and judges. You shall neither side with the mighty. And so this is the Hebrew rabbim. This is the JPS translation, mighty. I've added majority because that's how the rabbis sort of read it. You shall neither side with the mighty to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty. And by the way, the next verse says, and don't show deference to a poor person. So don't take sides. Don't pervert justice by inappropriately siding with either the mighty or the poor. And the Hebrew here, this is the phrase that the rabbis rely on so significantly. Acharei rabim lahatot. They, as we just saw, they use those three Hebrew words to establish the principle of majority rule. But in the biblical context, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It may mean it can mean either of two things. Don't give testimony that inappropriately favors the mighty or the wealthy, let's say, in contrast to the poor litigant in the case. Or it could mean, if you believe something, as either a litigant or a judge, if you believe in a certain position, don't simply submit your will to the majority. Try to convince them that you're right. It's not crystal clear what it means in its original context. My point here, though, in including it, is to show that the rabbis read a lot into these three Hebrew words, acharei rabim lahatot, just like they had read a lot into the phrase lo tasur, do not deviate. Here, too, they read a lot into these biblical words to establish the principle of majority rule. In combination, you shall not deviate, combined with follow the majority rule, became a very stiff competitor to the no amendment clause. So we had the no amendment clause, but all of a sudden we have competing principles that, through their interpretation, the rabbis have granted themselves great license to interpret the Torah itself. Okay, so let's see how some of this license played out. We've now seen that interpretation, that's sort of the first, I'll call it the first level of rabbinic authority vis-a-vis the written Torah, through the rabbis' significant license to interpret the Torah. They extracted meaning from it in a way that they believed did not violate the no amendment clause. But, one could argue that their extraction of meaning through sometimes very creative interpretive processes does represent supplementing the Torah in a way that one could argue ran afoul of the no amendment clause. I'm going to move on now to sort of legislative enactments in which the rabbis, they recognized, they created a category called takanot and gzeirot, or negative decrees. Takanot are positive, affirmative obligations, in which the rabbis played not a judicial role, excuse me, not a role of resolving disputes between litigants, but a legislative role. They were actually establishing new law in a way that more problematically competes with the no amendment clause. So Leviticus says, on the first day of Sukkot, you shall take the product of beautiful trees, etc. These are the what rabbinic tradition says is the etrog and the plants that make up the lulav that we take together. Those are the four species. Remember, Rashi says, the Torah says there are four species. If you say there should be added a fifth, then you are definitely violating the no amendment clause. But another thing that the Bible says is take up those four species only on the first day. It says, "Ulekachtem lachem bayom harishon," the four species, but rejoice for 7 days. So you should rejoice for 7 days, but only take up the lulav and etrog on the first day. Now, is that what we do today? No. Today, and for a long time, Jews have taken up the lulav and etrog, other than on the Sabbath, every day of the holiday, not just on the first day. And we see that in Mishnah Sukkah, and it's discussed further in the Talmud, that is the commentary on the Mishnah. So this is from the year about 200 CE. It says, in earlier times, that's what Barishonah refers to, some earlier period during the temple era, it's referring to before the temple was destroyed. The lulav was taken, and by lulav they mean the four species, was taken in the temple for 7 days, and in the rest of the country outside the temple for 1 day. But once the temple was destroyed, and the Mishnah was sort of generated and codified or canonized after the destruction of the temple, once the temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted an ordinance. And here, it's from the Hebrew word Hitkin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And so the Hitkin means he instituted an ordinance, or a takana, that the lulav should be taken even in the rest of the country for 7 days in commemoration of the temple. And that's what we do today. Without getting into any history about the laws of Sukkot, and there have been books written about it. It's an interesting holiday, and its laws are fascinating. But the Mishnah is open. It's not trying to hide the fact that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, a great rabbi in I believe the 2nd century, instituted a new law. This is a new ordinance. He justified it by saying that, this will help people commemorate the temple, because in the temple the lulav and etrog were taken up for 7 days. So here, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying, I'm going to newly institute a new obligation for everyone to take it up so that we can remember the temple in more concrete ways, in more concrete terms, during the holiday of Sukkot. Well, that seems, I will say, that seems problematic because we have a no amendment clause. Rashi told us don't add in any quantitative ways to the laws of the Torah. And Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, and this became the law. Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted an affirmative obligation to take the lulav and etrog for 7 days, not for the single first day as the written Torah had prescribed. So that seems to be problematic in light of the no amendment clause. Well, how did the rabbis rationalize instituting new legislation? This is effectively a new legislation in light of the no amendment clause, particularly if the no amendment clause is construed to refer primarily to quantitative alteration of the Torah's laws. The rabbis justified and rationalized it in an interesting way. They did so on the basis of this verse from Leviticus. So again, this is going back to the biblical Torah. And you shall, and I wrote this, keep, guard, or protect. Ushmartem et mishmarti. I actually read this in shul yesterday. For those of you who were in shul, this was part of the parsha that we read. And you shall keep or guard or protect my charge. So this is God speaking. Not to engage in any of the abhorrent practices that were carried on before you, and you shall not defile yourselves through them. I, the Lord, am your God. The rabbis, I will say, I will try to show you right now, read a lot, as they have a tendency to do, read a lot into only a few Hebrew words, ushmartem et mishmarti. So those, again, fairly sort of mundane words in the Torah, God again saying, I'm giving you a lot of commandments, keep them, and stay away from all the bad idolatrous practices from prior periods and from all the people around you. You don't want to defile yourselves through those bad practices. Make sure you meticulously guard and implement what I'm telling you to do. That's what God said through the Sinai revelation. But the rabbis read a lot into those three simple Hebrew words, ushmartem et mishmarti. Pirkei Avot, the first Mishnah, usually this is looked at for the beginning of it. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted to Joshua, etc. I've taught this in prior classes to show that the rabbis had a notion of the oral law as traceable back to Mount Sinai. But I'm going to focus on the second part of it for now. They said three things. So I think it refers to the men of the great assembly. Said, be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and this is the one I'll focus on, and make a fence around the Torah. Va'asu seyag la Torah. And why is that? Why is that an important principle? So again, this is the first Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, which Jews have been studying for centuries. It has a great advice to us about how we should live our lives. And right at the beginning, it says, among three things we should be mindful of is put a fence around the Torah. That's one of the. So it seems to be a very fundamental principle. Well, where does that come from? Where does putting a fence around the Torah come from? So Maimonides teaches us. He's citing that final clause from the first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. They mean to say, so the rabbis of the Mishnah mean to say, that the rabbinically mandated decrees and ordinances, so in Hebrew, hagzerot v'atakanot, so that both sort of negative legislation and affirmative positive legislation that distance a man from sin. So the fence around the Torah represent the new legislation that the rabbis can implement in order that we Jews should not sin and violate the Torah. And how did they make that connection? As God stated, and you shall guard my guarding. That's what we just read up here in Leviticus. And you shall keep or guard my guarding. Ushmartem et mishmarti. It's the same shorish, the same Hebrew word root in both words. And so the rabbis learned from those three Hebrew words that we should guard the sort of protective measures that God had commanded us to fulfill. And the Talmud explains it means make a fence for my guarding. So again, it's a little bit of a jump, but from these three Hebrew words, ushmartem et mishmarti, the rabbis learn that they should set up preventive measures, additional legislation. They should create new legislation so that the measures implemented in the Torah should not be violated. So they gave themselves the right to create new legislation, and they derive that right from the Torah itself. I'm going to conclude today's session. So we have now, I've touched on, we'll come back to these issues in the final session, but we've seen, I've tried to show in sort of in a quick manner that the rabbis gave themselves the right to interpret the Torah, and they generally don't have a problem at all. They don't seem to evince any self-consciousness about their right to interpret the Torah as that being in violation of the No Amendment Clause, because I think they thought they were simply deriving the meaning from the Torah that God had in mind for us to derive. This gets back to Michael Berger's point from that passage I read, that the more that they granted themselves the right to innovate, so as we move from interpretation to legislation, new legislation, no one will argue that it's old, it's new. It's new stuff that the rabbis are telling us to do. That is closer to being a violation of the No Amendment Clause. And then even further, the rabbis granted themselves the right to amend the Torah. So we have a No Amendment Clause, and I said it became over time in competition with other verses that the rabbis cited that granted themselves the right to interpret the Torah. But they also sort of arrogated to themselves the right to amend the Torah in certain circumstances, and without running afoul, without violating the No Amendment Clause. They use a few verses to justify their right to do so. This is the primary one. It's from the book of Psalms. It's not even from the Torah itself. It's from Tanakh. 8 lasot lashem heferu toratecha. It is a time to act for the Lord, for they have violated your teaching, which the rabbis sort of interpreted to mean when there is the risk of Jews violating the Torah, they can somehow tinker with the Torah to prevent further erosion of the Torah's authority. Maimonides explains that. So Maimonides in this passage from the Mishnah Torah's Great Code of Jewish Law explains the circumstances in which the rabbis properly implement their right to amend the Torah despite Baal Tosif, despite the No Amendment Clause. Maimonides wrote, any rabbinic court may uproot even the words of the divine Torah as a matter of ad hoc temporary exigency. All of these English words are in hora'at sha'ah, as the hour may require. So if there's an emergency, if there's something that is deemed or designated a sort of exigency, an emergency situation, the rabbis can amend the Torah. That's what they're saying. That's what he's confirming. If a court sees that it is necessary to strengthen the faith and create a safeguard so that the people will not violate Torah law, they may apply beatings and punishments that are not sanctioned by Torah. But Maimonides makes clear, and this we'll come back to in session 3, they may not, however, establish the temporary matter for posterity and say that this is permanent law. So they can't alter the Torah and say, oh, by the way, this is what we Jews should do forever. It can only be a provisional measure. Similarly, if they saw that temporarily it was necessary to annul a positive commandment or violate a negative commandment in order to bring people at large back to the Jewish faith or to prevent many Jews from transgressing in other matters, they may do as the hour requires. So again, if exigency requires the rabbis to tinker with the Torah, they can do so. To explain, and he uses this medical analogy, just like a doctor may amputate a person's hand or foot so that the person as a whole will live, so too at times, and Maimonides places restrictions on the rabbi's ability to amend the Torah, the court may rule to violate some of the commandments temporarily so that the rest of the commandments may be preserved. In this vein, the sages of the previous generations said, desecrate one Sabbath for a person's sake so that he will keep many Sabbaths. That in that context, it was about pikuach nefesh, about protecting human health, that we can violate the Shabbat to preserve someone's health so that that person will be around to observe many more Shabbatot. So Maimonides is just using that as an analog that sometimes the rabbis needed to alter the Torah in certain historical situations so that the Torah more generally could be preserved and the people's commitment to it would not be eroded. But Maimonides clarifies in the introduction to the Mishneh Torah, concerning what did the Torah caution, you shall not add to it nor take away from it. So this is another passage in which Maimonides is clarifying the scope of the no amendment clause. He writes that no prophet shall be entitled to introduce anything new and say that God commanded us concerning this commandment, either to add it to the commandments or take away. So Maimonides is saying you can't have a prophet or a rabbinic sage introduce something new and say, oh, by the way, you should do it, and I'm telling you that God says that you should do it. That would be a violation of the no amendment clause. But, he notes, if a court, together with a prophet who might exist at that time, and by implication, the rabbinic sages of each generation, if they added a commandment, so in apparent or seeming violation of the no amendment clause, if they added a commandment through a takana, and a positive enactment, a temporary injunction, hora'at sha'ah, or a decree, gzeirah, doing so is not an addition, because they did not claim by through their new legislation. If they don't claim that God is behind the new legislation, then they're within their rights to do so. Or he uses the example of reading the Megillah. Again, Purim, like Hanukkah, is a post-biblical holiday. That's why the rabbis felt the need to rationalize the blessing we say in lighting the Hanukkah candles. If you don't package new legislation as being part of the divine revelation, according to Maimonides, and it's only provisional in nature, it's not established for all times as a permanent measure, it's okay. It's within the rabbi's right to amend the Torah. Again, they rely on that eight lasot lashem heferu toratecha, that passage, and a few others. But if they had said so if the rabbinic sage enacts new legislation and says, oh, by the way, God says we should do this, they would be adding to the Torah in violation of the no amendment clause. So this is an important passage in which Maimonides is clarifying the scope of the no amendment clause and confirming that the rabbis have the ability to amend the Torah under certain circumstances. I want to end the session just with a quote from this very useful book by Rabbi Joel Roth. I took a Talmud class in the rabbinic school at JTS with Rabbi Roth, and he sort of sums up what I want to end the session with is the problem of if the rabbis granted themselves great power to not only interpret the Torah, but to create new legislation and under certain circumstances to amend the Torah, it's problematic in light of Baal Tosif, in light of the no amendment clause. And Rabbi Roth wrote in that book, in theological terms, the problem may be stated like this. If the power of the sages includes even the right to amend or abrogate the undisputed or accepted will of God, as embodied in norms that are designated by the tradition of as deoraita, that they are of divine Torah provenance and status. So if the sages say we have the right to amend such Torah norms, such Torah obligations, or practices, is it not the case that the system, the halakhic Jewish legal system, recognizes the sages as God, rather than recognizing God as God? And if this is the case, does it not follow that the God-centered legal system has collapsed because of the sage's usurpation of God's place within it. This passage, I'll end by saying this passage from Rabbi Roth, I think is very useful in terms of the problem that I'm trying to identify and how the rabbis needed to navigate the No Amendment Clause, because if they granted themselves even the right to amend the Torah under certain circumstances, that had to be massaged and navigated in light of the No Amendment Clause. Of course, Rabbi Roth did not. He's a committed halachic Jew, and so he didn't think that the rabbis were putting themselves as God, but he identified that it was a problem that the rabbis knew that they themselves had to figure out in light of the No Amendment Clause and the great power they had granted themselves. So with that, I'm going to stop. We can take a couple minutes. If anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself and we can take a couple minutes. Anyone? Okay. I guess I was crystal clear. So thank you everyone for joining me today. And again, thank you to those who participated in the Shabbaton. I'm going to come back next week to something that Professor Shapiro actually said yesterday about the No Amendment Clause, about Baal Tosif. He recited an incident or related an incident about a rabbi who thought that lying or distorting some truth about the halachic system was permissible, so that Jews would remain firm in their commitment to halakha, to Jewish law, and the lie would be elevating the status of a law from a rabbinic law to a Torah law. Could you lie and elevate the status so that the commitment of Jews to the halakha more generally could be strengthened? We're going to come back to the issue of derabanan, rabbinic laws, and deoraita laws, and how the status of laws played out in light of the No Amendment Clause, competing with these principles that we just looked at today of the rabbis granting to themselves great power to derive meaning from the Torah, and in some circumstances to amend it. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day, and hope you return next week for the last session.
Mark, isn't the next session, the last session in 2
yes,
weeks?
Diane, thank you. The next session is not next week. Don't come back next week. The next session is in 2 weeks. Next Sunday is Mother's Day. So happy Mother's Day to all the mothers out there. I never have a class on Mother's Day. So in 2 weeks, we will conclude the course. So thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Are the source sheets available? Are your source?
I can make my source sheet available. Yeah, sure. I'll do that.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.